in my presentation, I would like to outline the main principles of how we actually address all the changes that Tatiana described in the previous presentation. Because as we all know, the agriculture is one of the most climate sensitive sector on the one hand, and this is usually in for every country if the country starts to work with climate change adaptation. And usually the agricultural or forest sector strategy come first. And because this is one of the most important and most climate sensitive areas. And in my presentation, I will be based on the experience and the main principles layout of the development of climate change adaptation in agricultural sector in Europe. And I will also give a brief example of a preliminary strategy for climate adaptation in agricultural sector in Belarus, which was developed several years ago. And I will finish my presentation with just a few examples from these strategies. And again, as we heard in the previous presentation, the climate is changing and really affecting the agriculture in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in numerous ways. And sometimes you can hear the opinions that like, oh, this is good, that climate is changing, it becomes warms, and eventually we will have a lot of benefits for agriculture. And in Belarus, it's very popular that eventually we can grow watermelons and melons and grapes, and we can have our own wine. And well, this is possible, but the research shows that this is absolutely obvious that the negative effects will increase the potential positive impacts that we may have for agriculture. For example, such factors longer growth and so on. So unfortunately, we have to prepare for bad, more for good. And this is already, there is a number that, for example, about 16% of agricultural sector, we can expect about 60% of loss in EU agricultural sector by 2050. And take into account that population in generally in the world and in Europe is growing. So this is quite significant impacts. And this is another things which we really need to take into account if we build the climate adaptation response in agricultural sector, and if we develop strategy, that the climate impact agricultural sector it's not only impact of agricultural production per se, or agricultural production how we see it at the moment. This is also in the many countries, and especially in Western Europe, but also in the countries of Eastern Europe, the countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and the countries of Baltic region. And impact our food supply is very much depends not only our native agriculture, but on agriculture all around the world. And which means that the climate change can affect the agriculture elsewhere, which on the national level may affect the food price, quality or quantity of products. And this is also a big impact for national agriculture, because apparently for a certain product, we need to be ready for increasing the price, or for example, total change of our normal food supply. And for example, our agriculture may prepare, national agricultural system may prepare themselves that we need to maybe replace some products which we normally import. So this is a much bigger changes than only changes in the current agricultural production, and this all needs to be taken into account when we plan for agriculture for next decades to come. And this is also a brief overview of the possible impacts of agricultural sector. And for South and Eastern Europe, and for Central and Eastern Europe, the main impact is expected from heat or cold stress, from water stress. Water stress include droughts and floods. And this is again in the previous presentation for Ukraine. we hear that this is going to be increase the temperature. And for example, if we speak about the countries like Belarus, the forecasts tell us that, for example, while the overall amount of precipitation is not going to change significantly, what is going to change? They're going to change the regime and distribution. So before we can expect that the distribution of the precipitation was more or less even with a seasonal variation. Now we have to prepare ourselves to the situation which we partly observe now, then in a certain period, I mean a short period, it can be months, weeks, days, we will have a really heavy precipitation and we can have a flood situation, and in another period we can have a drought. So we need to prepare ourselves to these new conditions. And here we can see that, of course, in the global risks and regional risks are much likely if we'll have less successful mitigation, let's say. So the global risk and risk for agriculture significantly increase if the temperature will rise for 2 degrees globally. And however, as we all know, we are not even nearly now on the track even for 2 degrees. So, which means that the situation that we have now in terms of emission reduction, it's, let's say, very likely that if we won't achieve even 2 degree scenarios, the situation and the impacts can be even worse. And this is again in the previous presentation, as Tatiana said, that 2 degrees doesn't mean that the 2 degrees increase will be in all around the world in some area, especially in our climatic zones, the situation can be even worse. So, and, what we can do, how we can plan for that. And this is again, this slide say that slide show the so-called cascading effects. So if we have a temperature increase in the certain area and we have impacts on agroclimatic system and food system, this means this the cascading impacts will have a soil quality and all the kind of water management system, and we have changes in the pest and disease, and also it will affect all agricultural production, price, quality, quantity, and not only farmer income. So this is which means climate can affect all agricultural system and agricultural and food system we have it now. Means that when we plan the policies and measures, we not only can stay within this domain of agricultural policy. So this is when we speak about adaptation in agriculture and adaptation policy and agriculture, we immediately speak about number of areas and number of policy which all need to be integrated. And will speak during the presentation. If, the title of the presentation is a principle of development adaptation strategy, and I think the main principle is integration, integration. And here we see this policy architecture for European adaptation, and we see CAP, this the common agricultural policy. It's only one part of the whole these policies to take in place for climate adaptation. And this is the first of all, it all starts on the global level. And on the global level, this is the three main agreements. Really kind of shows very well the three main dimensions that we need to have when we're speaking about climate adaptation in agriculture. First is a climate policy. This is a Paris Agreement, and we can say within the Paris Agreement there is a special cluster of policy and discussion called Karanivia process. We specifically focus on developing a measure of adaptation in agriculture. This is another thing is Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, because when we about adaptation in every sector, we need to take into account that we are immediately speaking about first is a disaster risk reduction. This is emergency. It's like a flood, droughts, something that like severe weather event that we have during the short period of time. And this is also a so-called slow onset event. And this is adaptation climate change gradually. And which is mostly we are not under the Paris Agreement. And why it's important, because from the perspective of management, sometimes we know that, for example, the Ministry of Emergency are usually dealing with disasters, and Ministry of Agricultures are dealing with kind of slow events and slow adaptation. And this is, at the moment, this is like, I think it's almost all countries, these things are very disintegrated. It has, and the main integration instrument we have at the nation, in the international level, Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goals, we know that one Sustainable Development and number 13 is specifically dedicated to climate. However, we have Sustainable Development goals like Sustainable Development SDG number 2, which is dedicated to food supply, and number of others, which is dedicated to water management and general security and gender. So this is agriculture integrated and need to be integrated in implementation of several sustainable development goals. And when we talk about the policies at the national level, there is EU level, and agricultural policy, national agricultural strategy. However, need to be integrated in the water policy in EU, at Water Framework Directive, and all the policy related to biodiversity and emergency policy, and so on, so on. When we speak more specifically on how to develop the national adaptation policy for agriculture, so the main principles of development adaptation policy in every sector is more or less the same. This is the first, it all starts from the first thing is assessment and ranking of risks. So you assess and identify the risks at the moment. This is something that again we hear in previous presentation about Ukraine. However, it's even more important to identify risks in the future. And here that can be very complicated, and this is one of the main challenges, because it's, first of all, how we can identify the risk if we don't really know what should happen, because we don't know how successful we will be in our efforts, and how successful, which temperature trends we can expect globally and on the regional level. And here, usually if we do a risk assessment, especially if we're speaking about the time horizon for like 20 years, we need to apply different kind of variation of risks. Usually in this develop a national adaptation strategy, we need to look at the different scenarios, and we need to know what kind of scenarios we can expect and how agriculture can be affected by that. And this is also, if we're speaking about risk assessment, it's very difficult to provide detailed assessment even on the national level, because most of the climate data are global. And if we make a risk assessment on the national level, first of all, we need to downscale the global data, and it needs to become how global increase of temperature, what does it mean specifically for this country and for agricultural sector. Another thing which makes this process quite complicated, because we can, on the national level, we can provide information of what kind of impact we expect nationally, and what kind of impacts we can. I think, and especially in sector like agriculture, every area and even every farm is unique, and only people who kind of run this farm and business and the region, they can really kind of say how this specific increase of how the change of climatic characteristic can impact on their specific area. Same crops, one situated, let's say, in the lower area and one in the high area, they can have very different impacts in in terms of the drafts and in terms of temperature increase. And here, when we assess the design and the strategy of measure, it's very important that all the process will be based on, because without the people from the ground, without representing different sector, it's very difficult to make why when we're speaking about stakeholder consultation, we need to understand that very necessary step. It's not just we involve people because we want to talk to them and because we want to. Right? The sectors and the businesses need to be important provider of information about what we can expect and what kind of measures we can. And now we have to the obviously the next step. When we define what risk we face, we need to decide, we need to define which measures. And here again, I can say that very often, if you speak about the development of adaptation strategies in every sector, culture, people can say like, okay, so give us a list of measures, which measures we need to implement. But here, like we can say that the measures, and this is an identification of need prioritization of activities, is this just the technical measure as such. This is only part of the process. And if we talk about the measures, we need to speak not about only agricultural techniques and the changes of crops, but we also need to speak about institutional structure measures and integration with the development objectives and identification of the current future needs. So once we design our strategy and measures, we go to the next step of implementation. And implementation, first step of implementation is because again, this is another thing that I would like to highlight. There is if you are planning for such an uncertain and kind of long-term climate, we need to distinguish between developing the strategy and because the first step when we develop the strategy on the national strategy, we can highlight the main directions and main risk where we want to go. But for example, all these objectives defined by strategies need to be then transferred to the specific plans, and these plans need to be very flexible, and these plans be revised every certain amount of time, let's say 5 years, because again, we are dealing with the situation when we are planning for very sensitive and very complex systems such as agricultural systems, and we plan for very certain circumstances. We don't really know what happens with the climate in 5 years, in 10 years. Every strategy, very important to have a strategy and a kind of direction. However, specific plans need to be developed on the national level, regional level, and so what the national strategy needs to highlight, what we all need to understand, the climate change adaptation, it's not only thing national level. Climate adaptation now it's an important part of practice for every farmer. This is another thing that I would like to specifically mention. This is part of development national adaptation strategy in agricultural sector, including and the reliable monitoring and evaluation system. Because, this is very typical when we design a strategy, and for every strategy developing monitoring and evaluation. But normally monitoring and evaluation, it comes as a kind of additional final step. But if we about the certainty, we need to know that from the very beginning, we need to set clear but flexible benchmark, and we need to know what we want to achieve. And climate adaptation, this is really, I would say, challenging. because if we speak about mitigation, emission reduction, we can set our goals and monitor evaluation quite easily. So if we reduce emissions, that's good. Reduce emissions, that's bad. But if we speak about climate change adaptation, and especially in agriculture, it becomes very uncertain. What is our goal? What is good and what is bad? How we can say that now our agricultural and the national level, or how we can say that our farm is adaptable and is about the certain goals that, for example, we have changed our crops, or is it about the process that now we are all aware that the climate is changing and we have the kind of integrated in our routine. So, and I would say that bit of both, and it's very important when we plan the measures and the benchmarks for monitoring evaluation. So we include not only the benchmark adaptation outcomes, but we also include the benchmarks of how good we establish our process of adaptation, how much we our capacity, for example, percentage of farmers are aware of climate change adaptation. And this is how well we measure the impact of climate change, how easy and how transparent is access to information. So, and which means that if you can look at these steps developed suggested by FAO, the monitoring to develop and monitoring and evaluation system of agricultural sector, we can see that this is basically the same step that we need to pass when we develop the adaptation strategy. This is understanding policy content, develop vision, and focus on the selection criteria, and focus on how we will measure this criteria, what kind of information we need. And I would say between the previous stages and this slide, the main message is when we develop a national adaptation strategy, or adaptation strategy, we need to have process in parallel. First, when we assess the risk measures, and second, for every measure, we need to have the criteria of where we. And again, as I said before, and this, if we speak about principles of development of adaptation strategy, if in agriculture, I would say the key principle is integration, but this integration can happen on a really different levels and dimension. First of all, this is integration between trade-offs. Trade-offs is like potential conflicts and cross-cutting issues, and integration between rules of adaptation and mitigation in agriculture, because we know that agricultural sector is served as one of the main sources, significant source of greenhouse gas emission. First of all, this methane, which is a kind of highly potent agricultural the highly potent greenhouse gas coming from agriculture. And here, this is especially important in the context of the main topic of this conference, organic agriculture. We can to balance the objective needs of mitigation and adaptation. We This is one of the way to look at this. It's develop a new approach to agriculture. For example, such a climate smart agriculture and organic agriculture, and this integral approach help us both to adapt and mitigate reduce the gas emission greenhouse gas emission. And this is for many sectors like water management, forestry, broader perspective of economic and with the international targets and requirements. Because now we know there are many international conventions, and there is a many international if we are developing national agricultural strategy, we need to know that, for example, we need to design it in such a way monitoring system that it will not means excessive burden, so it will not be another set of requirements that the Ministry of Agriculture needs to support, and ideally it needs to be harmonized, and it needs to include the same requirements that the country has for international obligations, all whole system of requirements and all reporting systems for harmonized. And this integration between the sector, because integration between the sector, it's helped us again to find benefits, to avoid conflicts, but very importantly to share resources, because very rarely, even if in developed countries, that the adaptation has a, let's say, separate pot of money, that if we design the adaptation strategy for agriculture, we will immediately have resources for that, which means being smart and really share the resources between the different stakeholders. A lot of adaptation measures include the benefits for agriculture, but let's say also for water and forest, and which means if we design the successful strategy, we need to what benefits we have on different sectors and maybe different ministries, and there's this financial resources and other resources to implement. So we need to be very clear, specific what kind of have benefit from it to pay from this. And instrument of approaches. First of all, this is a big trend on adaptation policy now, that we need to integrate objective of disaster risk reduction and long-term climate adaptation. And as I said before, like usually these measures and these actions are dealt by different ministries. So we need to integrate it. And this is very important, that the basic information and all information which we basically on come from meteorological services, and the part of the strategy should be what kind of information the meteorological services should provide, how we can interpret this information for using on the national and local level. So this is also part of the strategy. So which means that every agricultural adaptation is only partly about agriculture. It's not only about agriculture. And again, the knowledge and education. So the first of all, this is a general procedure for strategic planning, how we plan our responses, how we involve our stakeholders. And also important part of every strategy, this is information of and education. The agricultural strategy, adaptation strategy should include education for farmers, but also education for people who are working on a different sector, how the work of their sector can affect the impact agriculture with perspective of climate adaptation. And it's also integration of this information in the curricula for students, agricultural student, non-agricultural student, and practitioners of every. And this flowchart shows that the main message is, if we speak about the integration between different level, so the different level has certain resources, and the main kind of the main objective of the national agriculture strategy is to integrate and unify these resources, because, for example, on the global level, we have the main policy strategies and main policy trends. On the national level, we can have rural development program, river basin management, and all different national programs. And on the national, on the regional level and farm level, we develop specific measures. So this, the good agricultural strategy, adaptation agricultural strategy should provide a way how to integrate all this. And this is also integration of measures of actions. This is it shows on a certain level, like for example, on the national level, we can provide finance, we can provide this infrastructure for informational, for forecast, for developing climate forecasts. And on the lower level, on the farm level, we can speak about all these measures to improve irrigation and different techniques, crop diversification. But the thing is that all the actions on the national level should enable developing the measures. Again, this is show the integration on the level of agro-ecosystem. So because on the successful adaptation on the local level, means integration and diversification of different measures and techniques. And I would like to kind of concentrate on this any longer, which means the successful national adaptation strategy should enable and should make possible that on the local level, people can really kind of choose and people can assess what kind of impacts climate change will have specifically for their farms, and they should be able to choose the adequate measures and then should receive the adequate informational and other support. So because it's impossible on the national level to tell every farmer and every region what to do, they can only do it themselves. But on the national level, it's very, very important to provide the basis and enable them doing right things and planning ahead. And here I would like to share some experience of the development of strategy for adaptation of agriculture in the Republic of Belarus. And the story, the background story is in several years ago, and there was a big EU project Climate East, and I think this the Climate East work in a different country of the region, including Ukraine. And one of the tasks for Belarusian part of the project was to develop a national strategy for adaptation in agriculture. And I took part in the development of these documents, and I took part on the later stage, mainly on the stage when this all the research, all the materials was integrated, and the final version of the strategy has been developed. And again, and I should say this was the first attempt to develop a complex document, more or less based on the rules that I just described before. And as we usually say it in the adaptation, that you can start adaptation, but you can never finish it. And again, this is the first pilot attempt, and some things was, I was thinking it was successful, something that was not, but this is just a general overview what has been done. The first of all, the first step, of course, it was a risk impact assessment. And I think like whoever starts to develop the risk impact assessment phase, the problem that there is not enough data and not enough data on the climate forecasts. And so this is to assess the risks that that was a European experts who had participation, who was part of the team. They downscaled the data of the climate impact assessment for Europe, and we all need to be based on the national data, and however, the big part of the work, this national data, international data, European data, was complemented with a national research, and particularly that was a two quite detailed research on the potential impact of climate change on the water supply and distribution of moisture in the air, in the soil. So this here you can see this green maps, and this was another research about the risk of the droughts. And as you can see now, the three maps show us the first, the situation in hands, and this is a potential impacts in the short period of time up to the 2030. And this is a second, is a medium term, it's from now to 2040. And then the last one, this is a really long term, this is projections for 2060. Of course, this is only projections, and we cannot say that yes, this is exactly the situation that we will see in the 2060s. However, that was very useful work because it really shows, and it shows on the maps, on the picture, the situation is changing, first of all. And second, as we see on these green maps, on the changes in the soil moisture, it's not linear. It's not necessarily now we will have kind of current situation and it will become dry, or it will become wet. So the situation can change, that, for example, the condition can be first more wet in a certain amount of country, and then it will be all kind of more dry altogether. But the thing is, if we're planning agricultural production, we need to be ready to both. For example, how we can, so that is for kind of for a medium period of time, we need to plan for one things, and for kind of longer period of time, we need to plan for another things. So how it can be done, this is eventually only specialists in agriculture can respond for that, but it needs to be taken into account. And Based on all this research, and was developed this map, which is a kind of quite popular now, because especially the journalists like it, because it really shows that the transformation is happening. And it shows the projected changes of agroclimatic zones in Belarus. And then we see if traditionally in Belarus we have 3 agroclimatic zones, and which was called Northern, Central, and Southern. And already at present we have 4 instead of 3, and we will still have 3, but it will be completely different agricultural zone. That the zone that we now have on the south will disappears, and we will remain only on a really kind of northern areas of Belarus. And the projection is that in Belarus by 2050, especially 60, we may have a situation which is close to the situation in Ukraine. However, and also some people say that, oh, this is a good because it's Ukraine is cool, so they grow watermelons, and eventually we will have the same situation. And but this is again, we need to take into account that it's not going to be copy paste of Ukrainian situation in Belarus, because Belarus has a different soil, different ecosystem, so that will be maybe similar condition, but it can mean completely different situation and different condition for agriculture. So, and this is also, that was another.
Masha, I'm very sorry. This is Evgeny. We really run out of time, so can you just please do it in 1 minute finalize, because we really run out of time.
And this is this was also assessment was made for different regions, and this is some prediction what kind of condition for agriculture can be for different regions. And what is also important, that went beyond the agricultural, and then this was a general outline what kind of priority, what kind of steps can be done to establish the institutional support, and what can be done for implementation and enable. So that was a part of insurance and risk prevention and policy innovation, and it was a special chapter of organic farming. So that was a attempt to make a really kind of complex strategy for agriculture and agricultural adaptation. But this is again what I need to highlight, and based on this experience, this strategy is not a plan. And this is a good things about all the process. Like first, it was a first attempt to make an integrated approach to planning for adaptation in agricultural sector. It provided materials, maps, and basis for further discussions. And importantly, it helped to identify gaps and needs. And finally, the documents was accepted as an adaptation strategy for agricultural sector. However, there is lots of really important kind of shortcomings, because first of all, this was done by international project, and unfortunately, the Ministry of Agriculture, they didn't express much interest to the process. They accepted the document because they have to. And now the status of this document is very uncertain, because to move to the step of real implementation, the plans need to be developed, and this is now like really in the hand of Ministry of Agriculture, and we hope that they will go further and develop the plan. But this is a big question. So we have a strategy, but I wouldn't highlight it as an absolutely success. And that's all basically what I want to say. And this is in my last slide. I would like to show some kind of interesting material that you may look further. And if you have any questions, and you're very welcome to contact me or my colleagues.